Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. It is an absolute pleasure for us to host His Excellency Mr. Stefanile, who's the Deputy Permanent Representative of Italy to the United Nations in New York. Prior to his current appointment, Ambassador Stefanile served as the Deputy Director General, a Principal Director for Global Issues and G7, G20 processes at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. He has also served as the Deputy Principal Director for Asia and the Pacific. He has previously served at the Italian embassies in Tokyo, Athens, London, and the Permanent Mission of Italy to the UN in New York. Ambassador Stefanile, thank you so much for taking out the time and for joining us on this conversation on the global agenda at the United Nations, interaction with informal multilaterals fora, which is G7 and G20. It is an absolute pleasure and a privilege for us to host you as the first speaker in this fellowship that we'll be running from now until December. So welcome once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your kind introductory words. The pleasure is all mine. I'm very pleased to be with you today. And good evening or good afternoon and good morning to all the participants who are online. You know, when we got in touch, I tried to think of a possible title for this conversation. I see this as a conversation, as you said. And I came up with a title which is general enough for me to make a presentation that can be of interest to everybody, and also a title which would allow me to draw from my recent past experiences that you also recalled in your introduction. And I refer specifically to the G7, G20 exercises, but I will mention also other exercises of a similar format during my presentation. So I will make this initial introduction on this title, The Global Agenda at United Nations and its Interaction with Informal Multilateral Fora. And then, as usual, I will be open and ready to answer any questions that you and your colleagues may have in that respect. In building my presentation, I will divide it in three main sections. One is devoted to the description of the UN system, and that would give you an idea of the complex scenario that develops here in New York, but also in other UN headquarters. The second section will be mostly devoted to substance, to the UN agenda. So what we talk about here, on which topics we negotiate on a daily basis at UN. And then the third section will be focusing on these interactions that I was mentioning between the UN agenda, the UN machinery, and the more informal multilateral fora, such as the G7, the G20, but I will also mention, for example, the BRICS and the MICTA, which are other two very interesting and important configurations. So let's start, if you agree, with the first part, the UN system. The UN system. You know, when most people think of the United Nations, they tend to think of a single universal organization based in New York, dealing with a quite a comprehensive agenda, a global agenda, and symbolically, you know, recognizable by this by the silhouette of this skyscraper, which stands only a few hundred meters from the room I'm speaking. And this is only partially true, because the United Nations organization is one single organization, rather complex, but it is part of a much greater, much broader UN system. And I wanted to help you visualize the complexity of this system by projecting on your screen a chart, which, however, for technical reasons, I cannot do because I had to move to my iPad and leave the meeting room where another meeting was taking place. But anyway, you can easily find on the UN website a chart which gives you a clear idea of this complexity I'm talking about, because you will see that here in New York, you have the major UN headquarters, where all the main organs of the organizations are located. So you have the General Assembly, which is the universal organ, full membership, 193 member states on equal footing. Each of them has a single vote to cast on any issue which comes under the agenda of the GA. Then you have the Security Council. As you know, that is the place where peace and international security matters are discussed, which has a limited membership, 15 members, 5 of which are permanent, 10 of which are non-permanent members. Then you have the Economic and Social Council. Probably, if we had to name this council today, we would call it Sustainable Development Council, and we will explain why later on in our conversation. Then you have the Secretariat, which is the bureaucratic branch, bureaucratic structure of the UN, and then the International Court of Justice, that is the only one of these 5 main organs which is not located in New York, but is actually located in The Hague, in the Netherlands. There is also the Trustship Council, which is, however, not operational any longer. It had to do with the decolonization process, which is now considered over. So those are the general organs of the UN here in New York, and each of these organs has a subsidiary organs and bodies which are under its direct supervision. So it's already a web of correlated organs that respond directly to these main organs of the UN. Then you have on the side of the UN organization here in New York, you have a constellation of agencies, programs, and funds which deal in various forms and in various sectors with matters that are related to the so-called UN development systems. So everything that UN does in terms of helping developing countries in achieving sustainable development. So just to give you some example, UNDP is here, United Nations Development Program, which is probably the main development agency of the UN, is based here in New York. UNICEF, which is so well known that doesn't need to be explained. UN Women, which is more recent in terms of agency and is fully devoted to women empowerment and gender equality. You have UNFPA and several others. And these agencies, funds and programs are part of the UN family. They are all under the ultimate authority, let's say, of the Secretary General of the United Nations, for example, in terms of appointment of their heads, but they enjoy quite a large autonomy in terms of the way they perform their functions. On the other extreme, you find another constellation of agencies, which are called specialized agencies, and a few of them are particularly well known, especially nowadays. I mean, everybody knows about the functions of WHO, for example, which is based in Geneva, and that's been and still is such an important actor in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. But also the IFIs based in Washington, IMF, the World Bank, those are UN specialized agencies. Most people are not completely aware of this link. They tend to think of these IFIs as totally sovereign and independent agency, but they're actually part of the UN family. In a, if you want, in a weaker way, in a way which is less evident than it applies to funds and programs of the United Nations, but still there is a clear link. So this is just to give you an idea of how complex the UN system is, because each of these entities has its own procedures, rules of procedures, voting systems. So each of these agencies has its own internal machinery to observe and to respond to, which might help to explain the redundancies and the overlapping and in some cases, even the cacophony of voices that people can get every now and then from the action of the UN system as a whole. So there is a constant need, not only here in New York, which is the main headquarters of the UN, but also in Geneva and in Vienna and in Nairobi, the other 3 UN headquarters. There is a constant need for coordination among these UN entities. Now, the UN agenda. Over the last year and a half, almost 2 years, the UN agenda, which is by definition very large and very comprehensive, has been strongly, dramatically, I would say, influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic. That is an obvious consideration which is in front of our eyes. The main priority, the main emergency has become over the last year and a half to how to tackle the pandemic, how to overcome the pandemic from the global health point of view, and how to provide equal access to vaccines. This is a major issue which is being discussed at length, and it is still discussed within the not only UN system, but as we will see also in the other informal multilateral fora. And on the side of this, on the side of how to tackle the pandemic, there's been also a big discussion on how to promote post-pandemic sustainable development for the future. So looking at the pandemic not only as a tragedy, because it is still a tragedy, but also as an opportunity to rebuild our social systems, our human systems in a better way. So this line of thinking, of reasoning, of debating has influenced very much the entire discussion here at UN over the last year and a half. Below, let's say, this macro layer of discussion regarding the pandemic, the UN agenda revolves and continues to revolve since the creation of the UN around 3 main pillars, which are the pillars dictated by the UN Charter. So you have the first pillar, which is peace and international security. And under this pillar, which is a pillar debated mostly in the UN Security Council, there is a constant discussion among the 15 members of the Security Council on open military conflicts. You may just think of situations like the one in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, or most lately in Afghanistan, which is one of the burning issues of these last weeks and months. But discussions under this pillar relate also to some regional issues, some regional peace processes, for example, the Middle East peace process, which is a long-standing one, or it relates to country situations which are characterized by high tensions or instability. And we may think of, for example, Ethiopia or Myanmar in different, of course, situations. Strictly related to these, a part of the UN agenda that has to do with peace and security, there is everything that relates to peacekeeping, which is one of the most recognizable functions of the UN. As all of you, I'm sure, know very well, the peacekeeping missions, the blue berets of the UN, are one of the flagship activities of this organization. And the mandates of the peacekeeping missions are decided by the Security Council. They are becoming more and more sophisticated, and they relate more and more not only to peacekeeping stricto sensu, but they also contain some more modern components, we might say. For example, components that relate to avoiding sexual violence in situations of conflict, or components that have to do with promoting the rule of law in the countries which host peacekeeping missions, or protecting the environment. That is another innovative feature of peacekeeping missions. And this is a big area of activity of the UN. The Secretary General a few years ago launched an action agenda for modernizing the overall area of peacekeeping, not only in terms of how peacekeeping functions are performed on the ground, on the field, but also in terms of more modern assets to be made available for peacekeeping operations. So that is the first pillar, a corollary of which is the activity of the UN in the humanitarian dimension, which is also another big chunk of the UN activity from New York, but also from Geneva. Then you have the second pillar that relates to the big chapter of human rights. And you know, this is unfortunately a highly contentious domain. It shouldn't be, in my opinion, but it is. And this depends pretty much, I think, on the readiness of each sovereign state to be somehow subject to monitoring and also to some sort of criticism in relation with the way it implements and observes its human rights commitments. As you know, there are several multilateral instruments in the field of human rights, starting from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that goes back to 1948, and then there have been many others, conventions, protocols. But at the end of the day, it all comes to the real will of each state to implement those commitments, and being also open to some degree of peer review and criticism if this commitment is not considered to be followed up in a reasonable fashion. Human rights issues here in New York are debated, discussed, strongly and hardly negotiated, lively negotiated in the perimeter of the so-called Third Committee of the General Assembly. There are 6 main committees. One of these committees is the Third Committee dealing with human rights, but much of the debate takes place also in Geneva, as you know, under the umbrella of the Human Rights Council. Third pillar of the UN agenda, and that is the third leg of the UN mandate, sustainable development. In this field, there are 3, I would say, milestone documents that were negotiated at the end, at the beginning of the 2000s, and were adopted in 2015. All the 3 documents were adopted in 2015, which is considered in a way a sort of a magic year for multilateral diplomacy. So we had the approval of the so-called Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which relates to financing for development. So everything that relates to the support that can be given to developing countries to achieve a prosperous degree of development from the social, the economic, and the environmental point of view. Then you have what I consider the most complete and overarching manifesto ever issued by the UN, that is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with. It's a basket of 17 sustainable development goals, which have been carefully studied, elaborated over the course of a few years. And then all of them compose this overarching agenda, which is created, and that is the real innovation compared to the previous Millennium Development Goals. This agenda, the 2030 Agenda, is based on equal partnership between developed and developing countries. So it's based on the idea of partnership and not anymore on the dichotomy, let's say, the dichotomy between beneficiaries and donors, which was the characterizing feature of the MDGs in the past. And the third document that was also adopted in 2015, and it's also a milestone agreement, it's the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And I'm pretty sure that you have a clear picture of how central the discussion on climate change is nowadays, not only here at UN, but everywhere in all international fora. And I should say pretty much also on national, in terms of national discussions and national policies. Italy is in a partnership with UK for COP26, which, as you know, is the next conference of the parties of the UNFCCC Convention on Climate Change. So we are trying to support the United Kingdom in moving towards a very ambitious and hopefully successful COP26 in Glasgow. I guess that you are aware of the main lines, the main coordinates of these very difficult negotiations. In order, I mean, to be simple in the explanation, I think the major stumbling block is the point that you have developing countries, understandably, asking for the implementation of the so-called principle of common but differentiated responsibility in tackling climate change, which translated into ordinary terms means that every member state, every state in the world should provide a contribution to tackling climate change, but the level, the degree, the extent of this contribution should vary in relation with the, let's say, the contribution that this state has given in time, over the decades, to the pollution of the environment, and more specifically to the emissions of greenhouse gases. So behind this reasoning, there is the expectation from developing countries and also major emerging economies that the so-called advanced countries, the most industrialized countries, keep their promise to provide $100 billion per year to the action against climate change. This commitment has not been fulfilled yet. There is a gap of approximately $20 billion. So this is one of the major stumbling blocks for the negotiations leading to COP26 in Glasgow. And it's a big part of the UN discussions nowadays. The Secretary General is personally pretty much involved and has shown a great leadership in trying to drive this negotiation forward. Let's hope that in Glasgow we can indeed reach an agreement on this very important global issue, which is probably the most existential threat that we have to face nowadays as human beings. So these are the three pillars that I try to synthesize in my presentation. There are, of course, other issues on which the UN are pretty active, and that those issues relate to the internal reform of the United Nations. It's a big system, as I said, so it's a system that over time requires some degree of internal reforms. I will mention just two items under this macro heading. The first is the reform of the UN development system. As I said, there are several UN organizations, programs, and funds that specifically work in the development field. So their main function, their main mandate is to help developing countries to achieve their goals in terms of social, economic, and environmental growth. And there has been a lot of criticism over the years about the lack or the insufficient coordination among these many actors of the UN system. So over the last 2 years and a half, there has been a new reform of this system, a repositioning. This is the produced by the UN development system creative initiatives, one of which is the creation of a new figure, the figure of a resident coordinator each development, which is ultimately responsible for on the field. So this was a big reform, a reform which has not been totally digested, metabolized by the system yet, but I think it's the right direction, and it's something that is almost unanimously supported by member states. The other issue, which falls within this category of internal reforms, and it's more sensitive from a political point of view, is the issue of the reform of the Security Council. So how to make the Security Council more effective and effectively representative also of the current global situations. And well, I'll try to be very simple also in that respect. There is a negotiation, a long-standing negotiation about this, which is also to a certain extent frustrating because of its length. And the point here is that there is an aspiration from some countries to a reform of the Security Council that can enlarge not only the category of non-permanent members, but also the category of permanent members of the Council. And on the other side, you have other member states which believe that the only enlargement should relate to the category of non-permanent members, because many of the problems of today's Security Council have to do exactly with the issue of the permanent status of some of its members, or 5 of its members, and more specifically to the right of veto, which comes with the status of permanent member of the Security Council. So it's a highly political subject, as I said, with also some important technical components, but it's also an important thing to signal to those who are interested in the current development of UN agenda and discussions. Finally, the third section that I outlined at the beginning, the interrelations with the so-called informal multilateral fora. So as we said, the UN, it's a complex system, highly institutionalized, based on very formal procedures. There are rules of procedures for any issue which is debated at the United Nations. These procedures must be followed in a very solemn way, and there is in all cases also a voting system. In some situations, in some organs, there is also a practice of consensus, which is regularly respected. But in any case, there is always the possibility to get to a vote on the basis of a specific voting system, which is enshrined in the Charter or in specific resolutions of the General Assembly. But in the multilateral fora that I mentioned at the beginning, there is no formality, there is no rules of procedure, there is no voting system. Everything is normally decided upon by consensus. So what are we talking about here? We are talking of groupings of countries which have decided to get together, to have variable degrees of consultations in order to coordinate their policies in certain fields. So from the late 70s on, you had the G7, which was considered to be the informal gathering of the most industrialized nations. Then more recently, from 2008, we now have the G20 at leaders level. Previously, the G20 already existed, but only at the level of ministers of economy and finance. Since the financial crisis of 2008, the G20 is now meeting at the level of leaders once a year. So those informal gatherings are configurations in which countries do not take formal decisions. They tend to coordinate their policy. They tend to make commitments of a general nature in those gatherings. But those commitments of a general nature, even if they are particularly significant and important, they need, in order to become operational, to be translated into actual formal decisions in the pertinent multilateral fora. being it the United Nations or being it other international organizations related or not related with the United Nations. So to give you an example, Italy is currently the chair of the G20. Over the last months, we were successful in forging consensus within the G20 on a series of measures that were aiming at alleviating for example, the external debt of developing countries or increasing international liquidity by issuing a new quota of special drawing rights. But all this was was the result of a political commitment of the G20 that had to be translated into formal decisions in the IMF or in the Paris Club as far as the external debt of developing countries is concerned. So as you can see, it's a different dimension of operation for multilateral diplomacy. I mentioned G7 and G20, but of course, there are other important groupings. There is, for example, the BRICS, which unites all the major emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they also meet regularly at the leaders' level. It's interesting to see how the G7 and the BRICS actually merged their membership, their respective membership in the G20 membership, which can be, roughly speaking, now considered as the place where the most industrialized economies and the major emerging or emerged economies of the world now meet together and try to provide possibly a common vision of the world. But there are also other configurations, like, for example, MICTA, which is an interesting grouping as well, and it encompasses Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia. Doesn't have, as far as I can say, the same level of the same latitude, let's say, in terms of issues that are discussed, or the same depth in terms of contents of its decision. It's more, for the time being, a major consultative group, but it's another indication of this constellation of informal gatherings of countries, which also contribute to the development of UN global agenda on the side of the more official action pursued by the United Nations system. So I hope I was not too long. This is, broadly speaking, what I wanted to share with you. As I said at the beginning, from a rather general point of view, from the point of view of a practitioner that has worked for some years here at UN in New York twice. And I hope that this could be of some interest to your colleagues who are listening right now. So I would stop here, and the floor is back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that detailed as well as broad overview of the UN system. While I invite my colleagues, the fellows, to raise their hands and ask questions, I have 3 questions of my own based on what you've talked about, and I'd like to start with those. And my question number 1 is that you mentioned rather humorously that in terms of human rights issues, while there should be a lot of agreement, there's a lot of debate in the various UN agencies. And I was wondering as to what are the dividing lines and what are the contents in these debates, because to a layperson, it might just seem very straightforward that most of the countries are in favor of human rights and against the exploitation of human beings. So where does the debate lie over there? So that's my first question. My second question is regarding COP. And we are, in fact, as a think tank, co-organizing an event with a UK-based think tank, which is titled as From COP to My Backyard. And that's looking at explaining and understanding how does any of these COP conferences, the decisions taken there translate into any change in a person's life, literally on the ground. So if you could, throw some light on that. And my third question is probably, simplistic and may come across naive, is that as a diplomat, you would probably
I'm sorry, but there seems to be some glitch with Arpit's internet. So I think we'll just leave it there. But I would, of course, be inviting the fellows to raise their hand and just jump in case you have any comments or any thoughts to share with us or with everyone over here, or any questions that you have specifically for the ambassador. Please go ahead. Feel free to please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yeah, I have to say that I missed the last question, but I guess Harpit is coming back.
Oh, yes. Sarah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time in Italy the past few years, mostly in Milan, and I loved it. I mean, for me, that is like the country of love, and by far the best food. So, but a few years prior, I had started looking into refugees. And when I got to Italy, I didn't realize that like most of the people, like right when you pull into the train station, like right when you arrive are a lot of the refugees. And I guess like that influx has been coming in for a while. And as I began to travel around Italy, I began to see that it was a huge farming culture. And there's like a lot of potential for the farming culture to be invested in, and provide a bit more jobs potentially, even just through tax breaks for farmers. I was wondering, if you'd explored anything in the farming industry for refugees, or like, what the plan is that you guys have already started on, because I just hadn't heard much of anything. But I could have done better research too. So figured I'd just ask you.
Hi, Ambassador. I'm back. Sorry, I dropped out. There was probably a bit of an internet outage over here.
No, it's okay. I only missed your last question. I got it until the COP26 part.
Oh, cool. So can I ask my last question now?
Yes, of course.
Perfect. So my question was that, Ambassador, there are so many long-drawn negotiations. So as a diplomat, I am sure that, before a lot of these negotiations, you already can anticipate what position which country is going to take. And, many diplomats, they come and go and from the same country, and they've been part of these negotiations. Where is, at what point do you really think that, or is there any time a tipping point where you think that, okay, this negotiation is really converging towards some agreement and we are going to make something out of it? Or is typically the diplomatic attitude towards negotiation is that it'll happen when it'll happen, we just need to do our part, and it'll just keep continuing the way it's continuing, and you never know what's going to turn out eventually, or whether any consensus is ever going to be achieved? So, yeah.
Very good. Would you like me to start answering some of these questions, including
Sure, certainly, in whatever order you like.
All right. So first of all, you spoke about these dividing lines in the field of human rights. So why do we have these dividing lines? Well, I have to go back to what I said in my presentation. I think the point here is, in principle, we all agree, all member states agree that, of course, human rights is a fundamental component of human society. So we all need to do our part in order to respect human rights. But then the moment comes when there is some degree of scrutiny for the member state. in the field of human rights. And that is the most difficult part, because the scrutiny comes with inevitably some degree of criticism that can also take the form of very open criticism and pressure from international actors in order for that member state to change its course of action. And that is the friction. That is the moment when the friction happens. And that is the moment when not all governments in the world are ready to accept the criticism and to correct the way they behave. Now, of course, there is a graduality in this, because there are, let's say, all violations of human rights are condemnable, of course, but there is a different degree and intensity of those violations. And of course, when it comes to mass violations of human rights, such as genocides or other crimes against humanity, there is also a doctrine that, according to which the sovereignty of each member state cannot isolate completely a government from respecting international commitments and obligations. And there might be even, according to this doctrine, which is called responsibility to protect, there might be also the legitimate right for the international community to put pressure, and in some extreme cases also to intervene in order to protect the citizens of that country if the government in charge does not do enough to protect them. So that is to do with your first question. On COP26, I'm happy that you are collaborating with the UK presidency. That is very important, because this is exactly the kind of issue where the action of governments only cannot be enough. I mean, is not enough to succeed. We do need a movement from the bottom. I was particularly pleased to see Greta and many other hundreds of young people in Milan over the last days. We had a big event called Youth for Climate, which was also, tough in the way the young actors spoke, but I think absolutely necessary for governments to be aware that this is something that comes from the bottom, and decisions, ambitious and bold decisions, are needed nowadays. We know we have the recipe. We already know what to do. There is a clear, detailed roadmap that has been already outlined and has to do with mitigation, which means drastically reducing our green gas house emissions. So basically CO2 in the atmosphere must be drastically reduced. And in order to achieve that, there is a very clear roadmap which goes through the transition to renewable energy, most importantly. Then you have adaptation, because climate change is already in place, is already happening. So we need to help several countries in the world which are already facing the effects of climate change. And those are not only developing countries. We see more and more often disastrous natural phenomena taking place in advanced economies, in industrialized countries. Last summer, for example, in Germany, which is one of the richest countries in the world, but still affected by climate change, still in need of adapting its way of doing to the new phenomenon of climate change. The same applies to a country like mine, in Italy, where we also see the effects of climate change. And thirdly, and that is the third leg of climate action nowadays, financing for climate. So you need more finance devoted to climate, and that goes back to what I was saying about financial commitment being the major stumbling block of the COP26 negotiations. I recognize that developed countries, advanced economies must do their part and, fill this gap in trust that there is at this moment between the global south and the global north. So the industrialized countries have to pay this initial bill of $100 billion per year. And that should be, the convincing factor for major economies, developing countries to come on board and do their own part according, to the capacity that they have to contribute to this collective endeavor. So that has, this was in relation to your question on COP26. I'll follow the order, so I want to respond to Sarah. And sure. I'm happy that he was in Milan and appreciated our food. Well, first of all, you have to make a distinction between refugees and migrants, because as you well know, there is a substantive difference between the two situations. Refugees enjoy a particular degree of protection, legal protection, according to specific international conventions. Migrants, they enter the country when, of course, they enter legally on the basis of working visas that the government issues. And speaking of this second category, migrants, yes, indeed, there is a specific program of seasonal visas, quota of seasonal visas that are issued by our diplomatic network of missions and consulates abroad that allow for a certain amount, a prefixed amount of migrants to enter our country and be employed in several sectors, but particularly I would say in the farming sector, which was the sector that Sarah was mentioning in her intervention. Finally, on your question, Arpit, on diplomatic negotiations, well, each negotiation has its own history, and main coordinates. I think that for a good diplomat, there must always be the willingness, the genuine willingness to get to a compromise. So at the beginning of each negotiation, it's pretty normal that you see that the different counterparts are simply stating their initial position, indicating their red lines. But there must be a profound awareness in each of the negotiating party that at the end of the day, it all gets to narrowing the gap and getting to a balanced and mature compromise. I have to say that I see this happening quite often here at the United Nations. As I said in my introduction, in many cases, resolutions, or even in some cases, big programmatic manifestos, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, they get adopted by consensus, which means that there have been lengthy negotiations at the end of which all countries agreed or did not disagree on the adoption, that is the consensus rule, on the adoption of complex documents. So most cases, I see this genuine will to compromise prevail at the end of the process. And I hope I responded to your points.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just one very quick follow-up on the last answer, Ambassador. So when you're into these negotiations, how much of a leeway do you have as a diplomat in coming to certain agreements? Like, do you always check back with, let's say, if it is about climate change, then do you always check back with the minister back home? And there's a lot of back and forth over there, which would obviously, draw out the discussion even further. How quickly are those feedback loops closed?
Right. No, that's a very interesting question. Well, let's say there are different passages that you have to take into account. When you approach a negotiation, obviously, first of all, you do it on the basis of some perimeter of instructions that you get from your capital. Now, and here you have the first distinction to make. If your country is part of a broader group of countries, which used to act as a single negotiating player, for example, in the case of Italy, we do have national instructions, but then at the end of the day, the actual negotiation is conducted by the European Union as a whole. On most negotiations here at the UN, it's the European Union that speaks with a single voice on behalf of its 27 member countries, including mine. So what you do in this case is, for a country like Italy, you get your instructions from your capital, you contemporate those instructions with instructions received by the other fellow European member states, and then you get the first result of multilateral diplomacy from the internal point of view of the European Union. That is, you get a negotiating position of the EU as a whole. That, of course, takes into account in itself also the interest of Italy and the other member states of the EU. And then you get to the actual negotiations at 193 countries with the rest of the UN membership. Not all countries need to do that. I mean, there are countries at UN that negotiate on simply a national basis, even very important countries, or also small countries, which, however, prefer to maintain a total degree of autonomy. And so you enter the negotiations individually or collectively, in the case of the European Union, with a starting negotiating positions. Within these negotiating positions, there are some specific red lines.
Right.
Those are lines that, in any case, you cannot give up during the negotiations, but you normally enter the negotiations also with a good deal of other points on which you can have a certain degree of flexibility. And those are the points that you, at a certain point of the negotiations, you have to offer the counterparts in order to, reach that point of compromise that is absolutely necessary to end the negotiations and adopt a consensual text.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, because these are the questions that we typically don't get from the official speeches, right?
Absolutely. But anyway, as I said, I mean, each negotiation has its own history. So there are even negotiations so complex. I mentioned, for example, the one related to the reform of the Security Council, that they inevitably go on for years without major concrete achievements.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'd now bring over Rory to ask a question. Rory, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to hear from you. My name is Rory, and I'm actually the G20 Youth Summit delegate for the United States for this year. And so it was a pleasure to get to be in the process, especially under the Italian presidency. I'm going to attach our communique in the chat in case you haven't seen it, but I would love to know, what has been your engagement with young people, and how do you suggest that we can better mobilize young people to take action towards these goals, which I feel like we very much share, because I know that you've mentioned climate, and I know that climate is reflected in our communique. But I would like to know, how can we promote better synergies between the youth constituencies and the representatives on the global level, so that way we can help support your agenda and you can help support ours?
Thank you, Rory. Thank you for your question. Very important one. I'm glad that you were involved in these discussions with our G20 presidency. Indeed, this is one of the features of the G20. The G20, and this is a peculiarity of this process, enjoys the contribution of thoughts from the so-called engagement groups. Engagement groups are groups of businesses, for example, or in this case, young people associations, but there is also the science network. So all these engagement groups provide their own views on the various items on the agenda of the G20. And this, at the end of the day, provides food for thought, and also in some cases, concrete proposals for governments to be taken to the table of the leaders for the G20 summit at the end of the year. So you were part of this process during the way. Well, I have no doubt that the most important central critical issue that is of interest for younger generation is climate change, by definition. Climate change is, as I said, an existential threat. It endangers the future of humanity. The younger generations are, of course, most part of that future. So it goes without saying that that is the most important, most critical issue where to involve young generations. That's why we organized in Milan this important moment of dialogue with the youth. It was not the first time. We had something similar here in New York in 2019, where when the climate summit promoted by the Secretary General took place. also on that occasion, there was a youth climate summit on the side of the governmental climate summit. Of course, it's essential that these initiatives are not purely cosmetic. I mean, it's essential that it is not done just, for allowing the youth to express their voice and then everything gets forgotten afterwards. I mean, I genuinely believe that from the youth we can get the driving force in terms of will and determination to change our system of life, to change our pattern of production, and in a drive, for example, in going towards an actual effective energy transition. All this can come only with the contribution of the youth. So climate change, for sure. There are also other issues which I believe are particularly relevant for younger generation, for example, protection of biodiversity, which is also strictly related to the environmental portfolio in more general terms.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think Rory, are you still there? Do you want to respond to that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for answering the question there. I know that a lot of these different issues are reflected in the communique, so I would really hope that we can have more opportunities, not just as a Y20 delegation, but also to see how we can support your agenda in the long term, because I know that there are so many important issues that affect young people. Some of the issues that are reflected in there relate to inclusion, they relate to the future of work. And I do think that as we talk about multilateralism, I think that it's important to recognize that it's a consensus-driven communique from the young people as well, and think about the ways that we can incorporate the next generation's voices into our current platforms. And so I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to get to speak to you today and to hear about your wonderful work with mobilizing young people. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me bring in Amina now. Amina, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. Hi, Ambassador. Thank you so much for the lovely presentation. That was quite insightful. My name is Amina, and I am a PhD student in the UK, and I work a lot on topics of, my research is on climate change and immigration and people, place attachment in light of the environmental changes and climate pressures. So I focus exactly on Pacific Island nations, and I study a small island nation called Tuvalu and how people move because of climate change pressures. So I've got a question that has been, bothering me quite a lot, because I want to probably in the future implement what I learned throughout my research and my research findings to join, for example, UN programs and agencies on sustainability, human rights and climate change initiatives and action plans. But my worry, why I'm worried exactly is who to use and who to employ in those agencies. So which is the best action or the best action plan. I remember someone from the previous lecture on comparative methods said something about foreigners working in Iraq and how they lack understanding of the local political security and geographic context compared to locals. So what is the best thing to do when it comes to action plans, initiatives, and climate projects and human rights projects in vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries that are prone to turmoil or to environmental disasters and climate change pressures? Is it to get to employ people who have the technical knowledge but lack understanding of the local context, the linguistic, cultural, and political context, and allow them to understand more throughout their interaction with the community they're working in, and allow them to understand more about the context and at the same time benefit from their technical knowledge? Or is it the best course of action is to train people from the local community to have the needed technical knowledge or the technical skills to work on any action plan or any initiative or any project, because they have the best understanding of the local context when it comes to the geography of the place, the language, the culture, and the political context as well? or is it always the best course of action is to create a combination of people who have the technical knowledge but lack knowledge of the context and vice versa? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Very interesting one. I think you, at the end of the question, you also got your own answer. And I would agree that the best way to go would be a combination of the two factors that you were mentioning. So involving people who have all the necessary knowledge, even though they are foreigners, they do not come from the interested country, but without renouncing the idea of training local people who obviously can have a much greater knowledge of the domain in which the intervention must be carried out. And this applies particularly to the categories of countries, the vulnerable countries that you were mentioning. You mentioned what we call here in New York SIDS, small island developing states, which represent one of the three categories of vulnerable countries which are officially recognized at UN. So you have SIDS, you have the least developed countries, the so-called LDCs, and you have the landlocked developing countries, the LLDCs. And for each of these three categories, there is a great elaboration work that is being done periodically in order to draft an action plan for each of the categories. So you mentioned the small island states. There is a specific action plan that is being reviewed every 5 years and covers a span of 10 years normally, which refers specifically to the challenges faced by these small island states. And most of those challenges are related to the effects of climate change. SIDS are the countries which are more impacted. Some of them are so impacted that they can even face the prospect of disappearing completely in terms of territory because of the rise in the sea level, in the ocean level. So obviously in that case, I mean, climate change is the big factor of all. And for those countries, what matters is not much, you know, the mitigation action, because certainly their contribution to polluting emissions is not significant. But what matters mostly is helping those countries to adapt to the effects which are already underway because of climate change. I hope I gave you some level of response to your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And over to Sunita, then Josh.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we talked a little bit in the questioning about consensus and negotiation. I wonder if you could comment on the role that mediation is playing in either a formal or informal way, and what are those challenges of really bringing in neutrality to that space through tools such as, you know, root cause systems analysis, and how the size and bureaucracy of the UN, you know, really affects the agility and ability to move more effectively in some of those critical areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Another interesting question, mediation. Yes, I spoke about peacekeeping. And I said peacekeeping is one of the most recognizable activities of the United Nations. But that has to do with situations which are already characterized or have been characterized by a certain level of conflict and violence. But mediation has to do with prevention. You know, when you have a situation of tension, mediation can help in solving those tensions and avoiding an open conflict and a military confrontation. And mediation is indeed getting greater and greater attention over the last years here in the United Nations. Because there is an increasing awareness that you cannot think only in terms of peacekeeping. You need to think in terms of peace continuum. So in the peace continuum, you have the prevention phase, that is mediation, so reducing tensions and avoiding conflicts. You also have, of course, when violence erupts anyway, the objective of solving the conflict by putting a barrier to greater violence and making peace, so peacekeeping. And then you have peace building, which is the third leg in the sequence. So you need to keep and preserve that peace and build trust in local communities, build trust among opposite factions, and try to create the conditions for a sustainable peace, a peace that can last for years and decades. So in that context, mediation is getting greater and greater attention as a means of prevention, of conflict prevention. The highest mediator of all is, of course, the Secretary General of the United Nations. In some situations, it is him personally who is involved in the mediation, for example, in the case of Cyprus, the Cyprus issue, but also on other situations. On other items, on other peace processes, normally the Secretary General appoints his own special envoy, his own special representative that exerts these mediation offices. And another important aspect of the recent concept of mediation is that women should be more and more involved in mediation activities. This is something in which, for example, my country believes a lot, and Italy, together with other member states of the United Nations, we have promoted regional networks of women mediators based on the conviction that in many cases, the direct involvement of women can translate into a greater effectiveness of mediation efforts. So we promoted, for example, in the Mediterranean basin, a network of Mediterranean women mediators. And there has been the creation of similar regional networks of women mediators in other regions of the world. And at the end of this process, there was the launch here in New York of a global network of women regional mediators. So this is another feature of the mediation efforts nowadays from the UN perspective.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I certainly appreciate that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And while you were talking about this, I thought that I'll just ask you this: if from this network at some point of time, if somebody from your office could connect us with one of the leaders in this network of women mediators, and we could host them probably for a lecture in this fellowship to understand the gendered perspective on mediation, and in general understand more in depth about mediation, that I think would be extremely, extremely valuable for us. We can coordinate with your office if that's possible on that.
It's a brilliant idea, Arpit, and I will definitely let you have all the contacts that you need with our people in Rome who are following this more directly.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador. So over to Josh now, and then Mary.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
We can.
All right, so I had a question on economics and climate change, and if kind of under the current capitalist model, if those things can go hand in hand. So I'll give a brief story on something I've currently been working on to give you an idea of where this question is coming from. So if you look at the Edwards Aquifer in San Antonio, Texas, it's an aquifer that's fed by the Texas Hill Country. A lot of the water comes off as runoff, falls into these limestone caverns where it drops in elevation again and then becomes pressurized and creates artisan wells in San Antonio that give the population their drinking water. So a big battle that's going on right now is just water quality. Since they're big limestone caverns, you don't have a ton of options for treatment. And if you have pollutants entering the aquifer, there's basically no way to remove them through these big underground caverns, rivers, and lakes. So a big conversation we're having now is engineered protection the way forward? I think engineered protection is something that, if you look at the economic models behind climate change, or I guess economic solutions, the private market always come up with the best option, because currently everyone's talking about getting into the aquifers, doing all this work, working on engineered protections to treat water quality when it's actually cheaper in the long run to just buy up all the Texas Hill Country, put it into trust, to never touch it, to never develop it, to guarantee high water quality to San Antonians. But the issue that you run in there is the municipalities in the state lose out on tax revenue by refusing to develop the land. So it just creates this weird paradoxes like which is better? Can you really have economic models and climate change protections driven by capitalism and still have these ethical considerations to preserving the environment and the world? Hopefully that made sense. I didn't know if I got where I was going, but it's kind of my question.
That's a very complex point that you're putting forward, but I got the gist of what you were saying. I mean, this dilemma, this dichotomy between capitalism, the capitalistic model, and ethical consideration, which is indeed part of the discussion about climate change. Because I mean, let's think of the overall issue of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energies. I mean, it's clear that there is an inertia factor, which is represented by the big interest that all the fossil fuel industry has in delaying as much as possible this transition. I mean, it's perfectly clear, it's in front of our eyes. This is why I get your point that the private sector, the private market can, in most cases, have the right solution, the best solution, but it needs to be helped and prompted by an ethical vision. And that ethical vision can only be provided by governments under the push of the public opinion. So that's the essence of democracy and the essence of how it should be in modern times. And that applies to all stories, including the one that you were telling us about the situation in San Antonio. And so there is obviously a dichotomy. I think the role of governments here is to convince the private sector to accelerate some conversions in terms of big policy decisions that they have to make. And you know, of course, in this, the private sector is a big domain. So you, as in human society, also in the private sector, you find enterprises which are more advanced in terms of their thinking, and some other businesses which are more traditional conservatives in the approach to business. So the governments need to push forward the best part of the private business soul and try to disincentivize, let's say, disincentivate those who would like to lag behind a little bit longer and you know, delay the process which is necessary to be implemented. So I don't have the specific answer to your specific question, but I certainly see this dichotomy. And I think, as I said, I mean, to overcome this dichotomy, the role of governments is essential, and the role of diplomacy must go hand in hand with this.
Yeah, I've certainly found that governments are often understaffed and don't have the ability to go and pursue these regulations and to pursue, I guess, encouraging private business to self-regulate in a way that's advantageous for the environment. So it's been an interesting thing for me to witness here in America. I think when it comes to engineered protections and having solutions that partner in harmony with the environment, a lot of times you're having those protections implemented by people that come from very rural areas, that come from impoverished communities, because that's the best type of work they can find. So they don't necessarily have the same environmental ethics that you would get, say, coming up in a university in the States or abroad. So you have people that are implementing these environmental protections, but I think the standard is often what's lacking, and governments don't have the resources to kind of follow behind and make sure that things are being appropriately done. So it just becomes a question of, is it possible to do that, or are we better off just leaving nature alone to correct itself in time, or are we ultimately degrading it further by trying to get in there and help? So
we've passed that point. We've passed the point of not being active. That's for sure. We have to take a stance, an active stance, very quickly.
Yeah, and the point is the active stance, getting away from nature and choosing to let it run its own course by us removing our, I guess, aggressive capitalist nature and allowing things to heal, or do we get in and use the private market to ultimately heal nature? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
I would
I think it's
rather
an obvious
go
answer.
But no, your answer was great, Ambassador. I do appreciate it. It was just something I've been thinking about a lot, dealing with that aquifer recently.
But the main point that I was trying to make is I would not completely trust the private sector. I would rather go for being active and being even pushy towards the private sector.
Absolutely. Okay, we have just about 14 minutes to go, and Murray and Lisa, you're up next. Murray, over to you.
Thank you so much, Arpit. Good evening, Ambassador. I'm Mary Sabina Peters from India. I'm a faculty of sustainability and energy. I work with XIM University. So I have 3 questions, if I may. One is, you spoke about the dichotomy. So here, when I look at the Nordic Circle in particular, and I see the resource distribution between the category of main countries there, and I see with the ice melting and the tectonic shifts happening and the continental shift happening, the resource block of Russia is going to be ever increasing. That be the case, where do you start your mediation or negotiation from and tell them, okay, stop exploring now because it is detrimental to the environment? How do we go about that form of what is a preparatory homework that we do? That's one part. Second, space is determining sovereignty, and sovereignty is pulling the shots today. Having said that, do we look at the Artemis Accord as a threat? Or do we look at, okay, if they're occupying spaces in the outer space, outer than the Earth, it's fine. It is not going to be a human security challenge subsequently, because that will really thwart all forms of SDGs. My final and my last question is, Ambassador, women are considered to be better mediators. Is it because they always have their way out, or because men don't know how to say yes and no and just stay there? Thank you.
Interesting points. I mean, starting from the last one, well, the easy answer to that, I think there is this awareness that women should be more involved, probably because men have already been involved and they didn't come up with great solutions to conflicts. I mean, this may sound as a joke, but it is not completely a joke. I mean, it comes from the experience that we made, and I think it's absolutely necessary that we try this avenue. It's a matter of equality, first of all, but I think in the long run, it would also be significantly beneficial to the outcome of the mediation processes. On ice melting, sovereignty, and so on and so forth, well, this goes again back to the approach to the climate change challenge. If you look back a couple of years ago, I mean, we were in a situation at the international level in which there were still governments denying that climate change was due to the human factor, to human activity. Now that belongs to the past, luckily. I mean, we have now full recognition, or almost full recognition, that human activity is indeed causing climate change, at least to a great extent. So human activity is something that we have to correct in order to tackle climate change. But then, I mean, the interests that can delay this process are huge, are really huge. I was mentioning those interests a minute ago when we were talking of the private sector involvement. So that's the reason why I wouldn't trust completely the private sector to go that way on its own. I mean, in some cases they will, and they are already doing that. I mean, some enlightened businesses are already opening new ways to business, which are definitely much more sustainable than it was in the past. But in many other cases, this is not the reality. I mean, they're dragging behind, they are delaying the process, and there is also responsibility of governments in that, because as you know, in many cases, governments are also subsidizing the research of fossil fuels, something which, as the Secretary General of the United Nations said, should be completely ruled out right now, or there should be a phasing out of a limited number of years. So these are big and difficult decisions to make for governments. In order for governments to take these decisions, there is the need for a big push from their own public opinions and parliaments, of course. So it must come from the bottom, as we said. And it should be based, at the end of the day, on close collaboration with the private sector, because the private sector can mobilize the amount of money that is needed for the climate action. And in many cases, the private sector also has the technical solutions to implement in order to achieve the objectives that we want to achieve in the climate action process. So it's really difficult. We should remain optimistic about the final outcome, but being also very active, very vigilant, and very pushy in order to induce governments to make the right decisions at the right time. I hope I responded at least to some of the points that you were making. You mentioned outer space, which is not directly related to climate change. It's a totally different dimension, very challenging as well. Outer space is much debated as well here at the United Nations, the peaceful use of outer space. There is an office specifically dealing with this, belonging to the United Nations and based in Vienna. And I think this is another frontier of discussion and negotiations, which is going to be more and more important over the coming years.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador, helping us know your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll get the final question from Lisa. Over to you.
Hello, good day. Hello, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Liz. I'm student in environmental health. Earlier, you talked about cooperation, and I was wondering, how do you cooperate with, I would say, like non-conventional governments? Like I'm thinking particularly about the Taliban in Afghanistan. This government, which is not widely recognized, how do you keep on cooperating with such actors to be capable to help the local population in Afghanistan?
Yeah, this question goes directly to the center of the discussions here at the United Nations. You know, Afghanistan has been one of the burning issues over the last months and weeks. And your question goes directly to the main point of this discussion, that is how to approach the Taliban authorities on the ground in order to ensure that the Afghan civilian population gets the support it needs right now, because we are on the verge of a humanitarian catastrophic situation for that population. So the realm of the discussions can be summarized as follows. Nobody is questioning that when it gets to humanitarian assistance that is needed for the survival of the civilian population, well, that kind of assistance should not be subject to any conditionality other than, you know, the classic, the traditional conditionality that goes hand in hand with the provision of humanitarian assistance. That is the commitment by the local authorities to allow unhindered access to humanitarian actors and allow them to operate freely on their territory. But besides that, apart from that, I mean, no other political conditionality should be attached to the provision of humanitarian assistance. And that is, I would say, collectively recognized also within UN membership. What is more problematic is how to behave in terms of providing longer-term socio-economic assistance for the reconstruction of the country of Afghanistan in this case, without, you know, compromising the principled positions of the donor countries. Now, that is a much more debated issue. There are countries which believe that there must be some kind of conditionality, some doubt this, some leverage to be used vis-a-vis the Taliban leaders in order to, provide economic assistance in a way which makes it sure that these funds are used for the right cause, for the cause they are given by donors in the respect of fundamental human rights and for achieving the objectives that the international community wants to support. So this is not the immediate discussion. As I said, the immediate discussion is more on providing humanitarian assistance. There has been already in Geneva a few weeks ago a sort of a pledging conference following a flash appeal issued by the United Nations that has already mobilized a certain amount of funds that will be channeled through humanitarian agencies, mainly UN agencies, for the benefit of the Afghan people. But then this issue of how and on what conditions to provide economic, more substantial support and funds for the years to come is what is being discussed right now. So there will be, in my opinion, the need for a kind of roadmap in which you identify very clearly on one side the objectives that you want to achieve for the well-being of the Afghan people, and on the other side, the conditions or the commitments that you want to receive from the Taliban leaders in exchange as a condition for the provision of that economic support. We are not there yet, but this is exactly the point on which everybody is working right now here in the UN.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We want to be mindful of your time, even though we have more questions coming in, but this was a really deep, insightful, and fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for being so candid and being so thorough and detailed with your answers. We absolutely appreciate your presence over here, and thank you so much for being the first mentor lecturer for this fourth cohort of the GPOTS Fellowship. Thank you so much.
I thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure, as I said at the beginning, and let's keep in touch. I will let you have those contacts that you were asking for, so that you can possibly build on them and create new interesting initiatives like this one. Thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Ambassador. You have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye.